The title of my talk is Race, Substance, Stigma, and the Criminalization of Blackness, 1880 to 1990. These are some very broad dates and a very broad topic, but just something to give you, my audience, something to think about as you engage in your clinical and research work. The title of this talk comes from my exploration as a historian, as a social scientist, of trying to find an adequate way of describing and explaining the immense and enduring stigma that people who use drugs, particularly people of color who use drugs, have endured for, at this point, if we take, say, the 1870s, which was anti-Chinese or opium laws, we're really looking at about 150 years right now. And for anti-black politics, about 130 years or so. It's a recurring feature in drugs politics throughout this country's history. In fact, a decade ago, when we first started to have concern about the so-called white opioid epidemic, in my mind, that is the exception that proves the rule. The concern was so much centered around how did all these white people become addicts, as though we expected people of color to be quote-unquote addicts. And by the way, of course, when I use the word addict, this is in popular parlance, and it's also a historical and social construction as well. This isn't my terminology there. This is kind of the public discourse. So I've been trying to think for a while about how we can think of this in a historical fashion, and I'm really appreciative for the opportunity to speak with you today because it has forced me to elaborate on these thoughts in more or less a systematic manner. Before doing so, I want to talk about some core concepts. First is, what is a drug, right? What is a substance? I think we can use a pretty straightforward definition here. Psychoactive drugs are substances that, when taken in or administered into one's system, affect mental processes, e.g. perception, consciousness, cognition, or mood, and emotions. These substances belong to a broader category of psychoactive substances that include also alcohol and nicotine. Psychoactive does not necessarily imply dependence producing, and in common parlance, the term is often left unstated, as in drug use, substance use, or substance abuse. That's from the World Health Organization. Then there's another one from one of our government agencies saying a psychoactive substance is a drug or other substance that affects how the brain works, changes mood awareness, things that we've more or less gone through there. These are two fairly straightforward definitions that I imagine in some way or another you all use in your practice and your research, probably with a little bit more elaboration, but these are kind of baseline definitions for us here. More to the point, what is racialization? And racialization, in a simple, it's a very complex dynamic, but again, as a socio-historical process by which racial categories are created, inhabited, transformed, and destroyed. And this is from Omi and Winant, two sociologists from nearly 40 years ago. It also connotes the conferral of racial meaning to specific bodies or body parts, behaviors, physical or mental conditions, political configurations, social configurations, etc. And anything and all things which give meaning to the idea or ideas of race. It's pretty broad, but just to give you some examples, in the 1980s and 90s, our public policy, our media, and our political leaders racialized crack cocaine to the point that everyone just assumed it was something you found more or less in Black communities. There's all types of racialization. A good colleague of mine recently published a book about how menthol cigarettes used to be a white cigarette brand, and then now, after several decades, are really more associated with Black tobacco consumers than with white. These are how certain drugs, certain substances may become quote unquote racialized. And then, perhaps most importantly, I want to think about what is stigma, because this is really complicated. We could go with Irving Goffman's original formulation from about 60 years ago, where he talks about abominations of the body, blemishes of individual character. These are kind of moral stigma. And then third, the quote unquote tribal stigma of race, nation, and religion. These are kind of the ethnic stigmas, or as I indicated in the previous slide, part of racialization. More recently, in a definition that I like more is Lincoln Phelan's 2001 definition, which requires the convergence of 5 components, and those include the labeling of human difference, in this case, racialization, negative stereotypes, categorization and othering, which, as they put it, the separation of us from them. Systemic discrimination and loss of status is the fourth. And finally, for my purposes, and what I think may be the most important, Lincoln Phelan tell us that stigmatization is entirely contingent on access to social, economic, and political power that allows the identification of differences, the construction of stereotypes, the separation of labeled persons into distinct categories, and the full execution of disapproval, rejection, exclusion, and discrimination. The part that I should have highlighted in that slide is the word power and access. So put a bookmark on that, because that's really probably one of the more important parts of this definition. So the concept that I'm developing in my own work is something that I call race substance stigma, which is, quite simply, kind of the multiplicative result of the 3 concepts that I just introduced. The idea of what is a drug, and that might be in research or in clinical settings, but also perhaps more importantly in our kind of public discussion and popular culture. There's racialization, there's stigma. So I think of the interplay of these three as manifestations of race substance stigma, which I define as the historically specific stigma which emerges from the interaction of the social, political, scientific, and legal constructions of a particular substance within racialization projects, and simultaneously from reformations of racial ideas and projects in the context of drugs politics. And also, just take a note, inherent in racialization projects are constructions, of course, of gender, sex, class, and a bunch of other things as well. So when I say race substance stigma, I'm not just saying race is all important. It's the only thing. It's kind of a placeholder for all these other constructions that usually condense around our concepts of race. This is really a more elaborative way of saying that meanings of race, when combined with the politics of drugs, produce particularly, shall we say, vicious stigmas against people who use drugs, and often the communities that they themselves come from as well. And I'm going to talk a bit about more of that as we go. My main case study here is, I'm going to take it way back because I'm a historian. And by the way, you should never ask a historian the origin of anything, because it will be a very long discussion. At some point, you'll end up talking about, Neanderthals or something like that. We always know that every event has a preceding event. But I'm not going to go back too far, but I do want to talk about cocaine at the turn of the 20th century. Cocaine, invented in the 1860s, isolated from the coca leaf of the Andean region of South America. It was a French Corsican chemist by the name of Angelo Mariani, for example, who created you've probably seen the kind of throwback posters in bars and elsewhere of Vin Mariani, which was it was a mixture of basically Bordeaux wine and cocaine, and pretty high levels of cocaine as well. It was marketed for first in France for kind of this, the bourgeoisie of kind of urbane sophisticates, such as you see here. These are actually 2. I think one of these is a famous socialite, but one is a writer. Here's just an advertisement for Van Mariani. This is another one featuring a white woman drinking. This is the bottle there. And this here shows a before and after of a man who apparently has lost his vigor. We might even say his masculinity. But then he drinks Van Mariani, and now he's got his get up and go, so to speak. Very much marketed as a drug for, not a drug. Well, yeah, it's a drug. I mean, they didn't frame it as much. They framed it as a tonic for the middle class. And that's how it was marketed eventually in the United States as well. At the same time, that Van Mariani uh, rose to popularity in the United States, we see an interesting counter development, which is medical race substance stigma of cocaine in the snorted variety, the powder variety, particularly amongst African Americans. Um, the narrative of widespread black cocaine addiction was, in fact, an ideological support to the labor control imposed on newly freed black Americans. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, local and state legislators moved to pass what were called vagrancy laws. And these mandated that anyone who could not prove their employment could be imprisoned, fined, or both. So basically, if you were black and anyone could just stop you, be they law enforcement or even a civilian, and say, prove to me that you're employed. And if you could not prove that, you could be put in prison, in which case then you would probably be leased out to a chain gang. This was the convict lease system that was enforced in the South well into the 1930s and 40s, I believe. It was basically labor control. Slavery was abolished, but this was one of several ways that the South could impose labor control. Basically, slavery in everything but name, if you get my point. And the medical establishment was participatory in this. They published, as you see here, these are excerpts of articles from JAMA, from the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, which was, of course, later renamed the New England Journal of Medicine, the Cincinnati Lancet Clinic, other magazines or journals as well, talked about how when black men and later black women sniffed cocaine, they became violent, rapacious. It's all these other tropes of black violence that really have been with us ever since. I want to mention that as far as historians are able to ascertain, cocaine use entered black popular culture from employers, believe it or not, who would supply it to laborers because, as you all probably know, cocaine does give you energy. And it allowed laborers to work, long shifts of hard, backbreaking labor, even in the rain or in the cold or in the hot sun. And then from there, it just quickly became a recreational drug as well. We don't really have any evidence that, it was more pervasive, let alone pernicious, amongst black users than it was among white ones. But that's really not the point. The point is the racialization of this drug. All right, I'm going to go to my next slide here. The media, of course, as the media often does and has done several times since then, picked up the stories and really exaggerated them. So if you were to go to a historical database of newspapers, it's called ProQuest Historical Newspapers. If any of you have access to it and you just want to, entertain yourself for a while, type in the phrase Negro cocaine fiend in that order, and you will be surprised at how many stories show up with exactly those three words in that order in the title or in the body of the story itself. It was veritably a trope in journalistic coverage. You see here, I don't know if you can see my pointer, but I'm circling this top left article, many cocaine users amongst the Negroes. Praised by cocaine, Negro runs amok, 4-person shot. A man and his wife were slain in their sleep by a Negro crazed by cocaine. Cocaine users shoot 7. It goes on. These are just a few. Like I have a whole, yeah, don't judge me. Everybody has their hobby. For some reason, I've just started collecting newspaper articles that have this. It's not really a hobby. It's part of my profession, unfortunately. But they are all over the place in this time period. As far as I can tell, many of these stories probably were also rationalizations for what ended up being lynchings. Many of these stories end with the so-called Negro fiend being stopped only by a fusillade of bullets and a mob that stopped him and then killed him on the spot and, burned him at the stake or hanged him by a tree. And one story that I read recently is where people took off parts of the victim's body as souvenirs. You all probably knows the history of lynching in this country and kind of the public theater that lynching was. And so I have a strong suspicion that many of these stories are actually probably a bit fabricated, um, as rationalizations, justifications for basically what was lynch law and mob murder. Because just the tropes are just so repetitive that it just seems a little bit suspicious. As I mentioned before, this was also part of labor control. The narrative of widespread black cocaine addiction, along with justifying violence, anti-black violence, either state violence or mob violence, it also was an ideological support for the labor control imposed on newly freed African Americans. Um, and after, like I said, after abolition in 1865, vagrancy laws show up throughout the South, which basically, like I said, forced black people into labor contracts that were not beneficial to them. They were, in short, they were unable to shop around the way you or I might today. If we don't like our employer, I mean, it depends on the labor market, depends on what you do, your other options, but in theory, you and I could go out and get another job. This was to stop that from happening, to keep wages in short depressed, as close to slave wages as possible. Um, as had depictions of Black Americans as generally lazy, dishonest, and criminal minded people who had to be forced into work, the depictions of Black cocaine use provided a rationale for severe policing of Black people and the coerced and even forcible extraction of their labor. And here, this is an article from the Atlanta Constitution, which shows kind of a not before and after, but just kind of a I don't know what you would call this, a triptych or just describing the career of a Negro cocaine fiend, I guess, as they would call it. This and these are, really offensive images here. This person here is, enjoying the dream of cocaine joy, but has these after effects of, I guess a cocaine hangover is what this is supposed to depict. And then this gentleman here becomes violent and decides to rob a pharmacy, and this woman is begging a police officer for money, et cetera, et cetera. This is supposed to be what Black Americans in the South are circa this political cartoon is from 1905. At the same time, by the way, in the early 20th century, around 1905, Black labor, in fact, was in high demand. You could not get enough people to work the fields and in the factories. And so if you were, it was a seller's market. If you were a laborer, you could in fact demand in a purely market driven economy, which it was not. One could have simply just gone with the going rate. But this type of ideology was a way of keeping forestalling on that ability to be a participant in the labor economy. Many Black laborers at this time had been unionizing themselves, even in agricultural areas. Many, if they didn't like how they were treated or they didn't like the wages, would just simply walk off the job. Um, which is, if you're running a factory or running a field, you need to have a steady uh, workforce. People walking off the job is not something you want, but you also don't want to pay them the money that they demand. And so what I'm saying is that there's this ideology of Black laziness and vagrancy as a way to pass laws to coerce them into work. The idea being that, well, if we don't force them to work, they're just going to be idle. They're going to live off the dole, off of charity, and you guessed it, they're going to do they're going to do a lot of cocaine, a lot of whiskey, et cetera, et cetera. Um, Tens of thousands of people were sent to penitentiaries, chain gangs, or convict lease labor forces. And that's just in Georgia. Throughout the South, I think it's probably hundreds of thousands, mostly Black, but also whites as well. It was a very violent period in U.S. history. And you see, these are just and some more articles. No vagrants wanted here. The police board discusses the problem of making Negroes work. They didn't even really hide it. It wasn't, they said the soft part loud, basically. They said they're very clear. It's like, we need to make Negroes work. Not we should offer them a wage at which they would want to work. We need to force them to work. And this is the police board of Atlanta, Georgia. Um, Here we have an Atlanta city councilman who, is telling stories of black, idleness, et cetera, et cetera. Here we have the labor problem being linked to the drug habit, so to speak, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so you get some of the point there. And then further north, I don't want to belabor the point, but I find this really interesting about how stigma um, has a political economy of its own. We tend to think of stigma, and I probably should have mentioned this. I did highlight power, but I just want to take an aside and say that for me as a historian and as a researcher and as a writer, I'm not interested in definitions of stigma that just talk about prejudice, as though the problem is that, too many of us are walking around unenlightened and we just don't know better. I think that's a cop out. It's not analytically, doesn't do much for us. And it doesn't get to what I think is at base, some of the causes. What I argue is that stigma historically has a political and an economic function. And that's why it persists, not just simple ignorance or whatever, that it actually has a use. And I'm going to return to this theme at least a couple more times in the course of my comments today. And so here, in New York City, there's a strike of laborers, and you have people in the New York City Board of or Health Department alleging that cocaine had been brought in by Black Cuban strikebreakers. People, when there was a labor strike in New York City, somebody had the enterprising idea of recruiting Black workers from Cuba, and then supposedly they brought cocaine with them, I guess, and they're tracing the problem of cocaine in New York City to, they're blaming it on black foreigners, essentially. I'm very doubtful because cocaine was everywhere at this point. I seriously doubt that it had to be brought in from the Caribbean for it to be there. But that's again not really the point. And then there's also, I said earlier that when I say race, I mean all the things that go into that as well, and that includes gender and sex, often geography, um, all manner of ways that how we are, our identities, the bodies that we inhabit. And so, as an example of race, gender, substance stigma, we see here sexual policing, which again, going back to the lynching problem, quite often the excuse for lynching many black men was that they had somehow assaulted white women. Um, Ida B. Wells, later Ida B. Wells Barnett, who was a black journalist at the time, spent years actually disproving this. And she actually tallied up a number of lynchings in the South and found that in a high proportion of them, these were really just excuses to, and quite often, take people's property, or that they refused to sell, or land that they refused to give themselves in the dead of night, being dragged out of their houses and then later accused of having assaulted a white woman. This is how Emmett Till was lynched in 1954. Simply for speaking to a white woman, and he disappeared like later that day or a couple of days later. And that was much later than the period we're talking about here. And so here we have stories of this is a white man by the name of Charles Johnson, who married a black woman, and they said the reason why he did that was because she had turned him into a cocaine fiend. So obviously the idea is that the only reason why an upstanding white man would fall in love with a black woman is that she must have enticed him um, with cocaine, I guess. Here, Senator Ben Tillman, also from Georgia, in the U.S. Senate, not the state Senate, like he's a national figure, says that lynching has been a failure in policing black men from assaulting white women. So he's actually, which is an odd thing to say, really, that even lynching isn't enough for him, and he's trying to pass a law of patrol of where there would be law enforcement officers who would just patrol, I guess, all over the South, keeping an eye on black. And he also cites cocaine as being a mitigating or an exacerbating factor here. So this is some of the background for a cocaine scare in the United States in the South. The first, by the way, because as I think all of us in the audience know, a second came in the 1980s with crack cocaine, and I will get to that towards the end of my comments. But I want to say now that for this long period of some, about 40 years, from the mid 80s to the mid 20s, even beyond that, but really the height of this moral panic, this hysteria was those 40 years. We had a number of results. One of them, I want to say, is that, and we see this also with the war on drugs, more or less, 60 to 100 years later, um, with the war on drugs and the depressive effect that this has on Black politics. And this is really important because when a group of people are so thoroughly stigmatized as being kind of wanton, perfidious, self-indulgent, hedonistic drug users, it is hard for their leadership to do anything but also co-sign on that as well. You're not going to see, anything that smacks of what they would call a harm reduction in, say, 1915. There are no Black political figures standing up for these maligned working class Black people, whether or not they use cocaine or not. It's not really part of a political agenda. In fact, Black politics at the time is what we call politics of respectability, where the way of doing politics was to assert that you were actually very temperate, sober, upstanding citizen, and that you don't really go to gambling houses. You go to respectable churches, et cetera, et cetera. It's very much a very bourgeois way of doing politics because that was the only way to do politics in the South. So, as an example of that, between 1898 and 1916, an HBCU by the name of Hampton Institute, I imagine that many, given that Morehouse is one of our sponsors, I believe, I'm sure probably everybody in the audience knows Hampton University. I would hope, as a Virginian, I certainly would hope so, and with Hampton alum in my family, Hampton Institute published a number of what they called Negro reports. These are kind of like research agendas done by Black people in the face of such libelous, quote unquote, science by white researchers. And the libels against Black people about cocaine were so thorough that they actually took that up in 1903 as an issue of study. Concern about the negative effects of cocaine on Black behavior and industriousness essentially made the issue necessarily one of morality. It wasn't, as those of us today in this audience would think, if we saw a substance use problem in a group of people, we would say this is a public health issue. That's even for this audience in 1903, it's one of moralism. In Tennessee, an entire political party was formed, a party of African Americans. Their basic platform was regulating cocaine and rum, or whiskey, liquor, saying, citing the kind of corrupting moral influence on Black people. A particularly conservative and defensive posture because, this is 1903. As a historian, I can think of a lot of things that were probably more threatening to Black people in 1903 than the presence of cocaine and liquor, such as, violence, mob violence, state violence, sharecropping system, you name it. There's a lot of things here. But the thing that they decided to seize on was we have to police ourselves and get whiskey and cocaine out of our communities. So I hope you see what I'm saying. If we were in person, I'd be able to read the audience and know if I was losing anybody. But I hope you get the point here that there's an effect of politics that this has, that race substance stigma has. And then, bad enough that Black political culture had to seize on this so-called problem. And I'm not saying that no Black people were using cocaine or that it wasn't a problem, but I have a strong suspicion that it was overblown. And there were more white people, definitely more numerically and even proportionally, more white people who were using cocaine than Black people. But it was really Black people that were the object of focus. At the Tuskegee conference, not Tuskegee, at the Hampton conference in 1903, the published estimate was that there were 20,000 Black cocaine users in the country. 20,000. Every media account that I've been able to find subsequent to that uses the number 200,000. That's the New York Times. the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, the well, who else do I have here? The Missouri Medical and Surgical Journal. Everybody that I've been able to find quotes the number at 10 times what the Hampton people said. Even as they're talking about the Hampton conference, they actually say, oh, these black leaders at the Hampton conference said it's 200,000 people, which they never said. I found the proceedings. So it's just compounded on all that. It's just a kind of just exaggeration to go with libel. A second result of this period is the misdirection of public attention to the actual nature of substance use. So as I said, this there was very little attention to how many white people might have been using cocaine, or the effects that it had on white families and white individuals, et cetera, et cetera. And these are because I want to make sure I have time for to talk about the rest. I'm going to not quote this, but these are two historians who have basically made the comment that I just made, but probably more eloquently here. And this slide deck will, of course, be available to you. And then reform of drugs between 1906 and 1914. 1906 is the Pure Food and Drug Act, which of course gives us the modern FDA. And then 1914 is the Harrison Act, which outlaws all narcotics and illicit stimulants like cocaine. That was largely based on race substance stigma, particularly cocaine. Some of the most ardent advocates for cocaine regulation were Southern congressmen who repeatedly stood on the floors of the House of Representatives or the Senate and said, the reason why we need to regulate cocaine is because we have too many Negro cocaine fiends down here in Dixieland, and something has to be done about them. So even baked into reform efforts was this kind of anti-black racism. To say nothing, by the way, of anti-Chinese racism, which gave us the Anti-Smoking Opium Act of 1909, and there's a bunch of local acts before that as well. There's a whole other history that's not included in this lecture that goes with that as well. And I'm ahead of my slides here. We saw something similar with the case of opium smoking in 19th century Chinese migrant labor. Again, a lot of that is labor-based. Chinese migrants in the western states, particularly California, but Colorado, South Dakota, and elsewhere, were often used as strike breakers. And so the ethnic tensions there, particularly Irish immigrants versus Chinese immigrants, was often violent. There were a number of race riots up and down the eastern seaboard, as high up as British Columbia, that were basically pogroms against Chinese Americans. And part of that also was kind of these libels about, opium dens and white slavery, et cetera, et cetera. We see something similar. I'm sorry, I'm ahead of my my slide here. And also, I said white slavery, the allegation that Chinese opium den proprietors were turning white women into sex workers by enslaving them to opium. We see something similar with marijuana and anti-Mexican racism in the teens, the 1910s, and the 20s, until the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. People like Harry Anslinger, who was the federal narcotics commissioner and just was, he never fails to surprise me at how racist and anti-communist he was from this period well into the 1960s. By the 1950s, he's claiming that communists and the Chinese and black people and everybody else are all in a conspiracy to undermine American morals with drugs. He's kind of like J. Edgar Hoover, but just focusing on drugs, really, is the best way to describe him. And he was responsible for pushing the Marijuana Tax Act of 37, the Boggs Act of 1951, and the 1956 Act, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a recurring trope. We see the same thing with heroin in the 1950s, and this is where a lot of my research has been, in a somewhat similar configuration, but also different. After the Second World War, we saw the rise of a heroin moral panic. The short story is that it was very hard to get heroin or morphine during the war years. A lot of it was needed for the war effort. Shipping was basically at a standstill because of submarine warfare. Um, and but heroin is easier to smuggle because it's distilled. It's not as, you could boil down X amount of opium or morphine and get it to heroin. It's going to be, the mass is going to be a lot, so it's going to be more concentrated, so easier to smuggle. And then once shipping opened up after the war, then it was just on because the organized crime networks were already in place. The French connection, the Corsican trade, Turkish, et cetera, et cetera. So, and it was targeted mainly in initially in East Harlem and Harlem, which is where East Harlem was where a lot of the organized crime families had moved their operation after the war. And of course, they had complicit law enforcement um, as well. And so this moral panic from 1949 to 52 emerges, and then it disappears for a little while, and then comes back again in the late 50s and throughout the 1960s. And so everyone's worried about juvenile delinquency, juvenile heroin use. There's the Cold War, the Red Scare, the Lavender Scare, the idea that homosexuals and who are probably also communists, were infiltrating the highest levels of government, et cetera, is all part of the zeitgeist here. This does not mean that white youth were not using heroin or other drugs. In fact, what was not attended to in this period was that white youth were using other harmful substances. Barbiturates and amphetamines were basically unregulated for a lot of the 1950s, and at epidemic levels amongst white youth. So was alcohol use. Even tobacco is something that at this period was more common in white communities than it was in black communities. Um, that's how we got menthol. Menthols were actually marketed towards black people because the idea was that menthol cigarettes were healthier because they're minty flavored, I guess. I don't guess, actually. There's a great book on that, but anyway, I digress. There were other substances that you would find in white, youthful circles that did not get the kind of stigma that heroin got, or that black people got. And in fact, there was no consensus on what caused addiction, right? As it was framed in the 1950s. Um, and this was important because everyone was looking for a cure. By 1955, we had cures or vaccines for basically every condition that had been a plague of humankind for the previous, several thousand years. Tuberculosis, cure. Polio, vaccine. Smallpox, vaccine. Scarlet fever, vaccine and treatments. You name it. So in the post-war era, we're really thinking about non-infectious disease, chronic diseases, and how we cure those. It would not be easy, as you all as practitioners know. But in the 50s, everyone thought if you just put your best and brightest to it, you can get a cure. That's important because when the cure doesn't emerge, people become frustrated. But I'm getting ahead of myself on that. And I'll be getting to that towards my concluding remarks. Also, race substance stigma continues well into the 50s. And with an assumption that heroin use was particularly high among Black and Latinx Americans, and that most users came from these communities. All right, there are also three ideas about addiction. One that emphasized antisocially and furthermore criminally deviant personalities. The idea of physiological dependence and the idea of psychological dependence, usually the result of psychological maladjustment. So all of these also go into stigma as well in the 1960s. During this period, as our researchers and as the media start to look at Black, in particular, heroin use, the race substance stigma also helped to produce three wrong-headed assumptions in drug research. One is that drug addiction is irreversible. The second of class predisposition, because of course the wealthy and the well-educated don't use drugs; they don't become addicted, right? And then racial predisposition. These were propositions that were based more on assumptions than about than from actual science. et cetera. But nonetheless, they held way into, well, until today. I mean, there's plenty of people walking around, holding one or more of these ideas. Um, and again, these were thinking mainly about heroin here. People were not thinking about white middle class people who were in fact using substances, maybe not always heroin, but ones that were probably equally as damaging. This met with the 1960s concept of culture of poverty. As I said before, if we had cures for most infectious diseases by 1955 or so, the new frontier in health politics is mental health and chronic disease. It's also a period of civil rights. And afterwards, after 1965, the post civil rights era, in which one of the main social questions is what is, how does America address what was called the Negro problem? When you see riots in Watts and in Harlem and in Detroit and pretty much every city by 1968, the question is, what is happening here? And so there's many explanations for what people are thinking of as a failure of black politics and of black people generally. The culture of poverty thesis was one that was held by, believe it or not, liberals and conservatives alike. It really was more a liberal proposition. It was the idea that racism historically had become so profound and so entrenched that it engendered intergenerational dependency. This was, for those of you who have heard of, or if you're of a certain age, you might remember the Moynihan Report of 1965. That was what was behind that report. This idea that black families, particularly black women, who are the transmitters of culture to children, were the ones responsible, not structural racism and social inequities at all. It's an imprecise theory, which is why racial conservatives could also pick it up and say, yeah, they just don't know anybody. They don't know how to work hard the way, native born white people do, or, model minorities that they will often hold up in contradistinction to black people, for example. So it's quickly used as a cudgel against black people throughout the 60s into the 70s. Even in the late early part of this century, there have been people who have been trying to, rehabilitate this concept and try to use it in social science. Um, so the drug issue, the heroin issue in the late 50s and into the 70s is also bound up with this. Is heroin use part of the culture of poverty, quote? If you're going to make the argument that whether you're racial, liberal, or conservative, the idea that it's certain, settings and family traits that produce really settings and environments that produce quote unquote addiction, you can't explain why so many people from those same settings don't have a problem with substances. Further, you can talk about entire neighborhoods which existed even into like the early 70s where heroin use was almost not to be found. Black neighborhoods in cities. What I'm pointing to is social ecology, that the popularity of substances was moving through social networks, not because of some sort of pathology of families or absentee fathers or anything like that. It's what people do. They explore their minds, and social networks will become vulnerable to an idea that a certain substance will help you do that. And then for most people, they walk away from it after a while, but a percentage will be caught up in it. But that's not what people really were thinking about at this period. They were more engaged in the ecological fallacy. And in fact, what differed again between white and black youth wasn't the scope of substance use, but the type and the visibility. People were not talking about the hidden epidemic of amphetamine use in the suburbs, for example, amongst white youth. They were not being over policed as we were starting to see by the 70s. All right, so this whirlwind tour of roughly 90 years or so. What I would like to return to my themes, and in a conclusion, I want to say that there are certain things that you as practitioners, I hope, will take away from this as you engage your patients. And and think about some of the structural determinants of health when you go about your practice. There's certain results. First, the war on drugs, anti-drug moralism, and insistence on abstinence they're poor approaches to public health. We know that now. The equation of complete abstinence with quote unquote rehabilitation is a bad equation. But it was the one upon which our policymakers insisted, until like very, very recently. The racialization of heroin produced a political environment in which elected leaders were very likely to propose carceral solutions. I'm talking here about the advent of the war on drugs. The 1973 Rockefeller drug law here in New York, followed, by the way, by every other state in the union practically, was the precursor was Governor Rockefeller saying, we've basically tried everything else and nothing works. And he was including methadone, forced treatment was something else that was tried here in New York. And then, of course, mandatory minimums became part of the Reagan drug war in the 1980s. All bad public health. Public health failed in other ways. Patient alienation. As you all know, patients will be, fairly reluctant to seek out any sort of medical help, not just for, substance use disorders, just general checkups, if they think that the result could be incarceration, or even just stigma, just like, a bad attitude from a practitioner is enough to be an off-putting experience when you've been so thoroughly stigmatized by everybody else around you. The spread of HIV is another legacy of this. The war on drugs and our attitudes towards people who use drugs were just completely abominable in the 80s and 90s. The criminalization of syringe possession, failure to embrace harm reduction, all of these contributed to the spread of HIV. It also had the effect of cycling tens of millions of people in and out of the criminal legal system. This is also working in tandem with federal determination and concerted effort to defund cities. This is pretty much where Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and the first George Bush were from the mid 70s until the early 1990s, where cities were left with shrinking budgets, even as they were given more and more money for policing. So education budgets drop, policing goes up. I think somebody may be not muted.
Sorry, I'm trying to find them.
And then finally, there are the political repercussions. As it had with cocaine in the early 20th century, race, substance, stigma had a depressing effect on the ability of Black and Latinx political leadership to be creative about what their constituents actually needed, instead of hyper-policing and inadequate abstinence-only treatment programs. Being tied to HIV prevention and gay politics, even indigenous, which is to say local community-based Black and Latinx harm reduction workers, found themselves spurned by these leaders, mainly because they were of a previous generation from the civil rights era, but also because race, substance, stigma was so intense and the stakes were so high and the amount of funding from Washington, D.C. was so low that they basically forced to choose their battles. If you're fighting for your education budget, for your health budget, to even just keep your streets paved, you're going to feel in late 1980s, early 1990s, that groups of people that you stigmatized for decades, they're not worth going to bat for. I'm not going to bat for gay people who, just name any of the pejoratives that were used in the 1980s and before about gay people. I'm not going to go to bat for people with substance use problems, use any of the pejorative terms that were used for them in the 1980s and before. They're caught in this choice. Even if they had better intentions, they could not have acted upon them. 4 decades after the beginning of the Reagan-era war on drugs, 5 decades after Nixon's war on drugs and Rockefeller's war on drugs, and 130 years after the Negro cocaine fiend scare, practically all Americans, I would estimate, still harbor some degree of race, substance, stigma. I mean, we can all say we don't, we're completely open-minded, but look down within yourself. It's probably somewhere there. You all are practitioners, perhaps not, but I feel like all of us, try as we might, it's that deeply ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist that we still might harbor even when we know it's wrong. Because no one is more acutely aware of that problem than the people that we are here to treat and to help. I think I hope that will be the takeaway for you all today. I think I might have run a few minutes over, but thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you.